Good day, viewers. This is 300 Plus Academy, where all we do is exam tutoring, ensuring you ace your next examination. So, what I have for you today is theory of consumer behavior, which is a topic under economics, and we'll be looking at utility and types, approaches to utility, the law of diminishing marginal utility, and the concept of total utility, average utility, and marginal utility. There is a general understanding which highlights that consumers are the king of every business. So most business organization works towards meeting the needs of these consumers because they understand that by meeting the needs of these consumers, the profitability of the firm would be actualized, as well as meeting other primary objective of the business, which could actually be creation of wealth of the for the shareholders. So it is very important. And how do they meet the needs of these consumers? They can meet the needs of these consumers by carrying out a thorough research, a thorough findings about the behaviors of these consumers, the attitudes of these consumers, the extent of loyalty of these consumers to a particular product, and what are the preferences of these consumers. So in a nutshell, we can actually say that all of this should be attributable to the behaviors of most of these consumers. Now, what then is the consumer behavior? You need to know that the consumers are those that makes final use of a product. So that is to show how important they are to the business, and should know that the extent of patronage that a consumer or customer have in the business will determine the level of profitability of the business. So the consumers are those that makes final use of the product. Now, when we say consumer behavior are actually those behaviors or attitudes that relates to the consumption of a commodity. Now, I'm defining consumer behavior within the context of this topic, utility. So all of these behaviors are expected to be monitored. So once these behaviors, this attitude, these preferences have been duly monitored, then the businesses can see a particular roadmap or a guide on how they are expected to manufacture their products or their commodities. So now, the essence of this consumer behavior is just to know if consumers are actually deriving satisfaction from whatever product that is being produced. Once a consumer is not deriving satisfaction from a product, then it is very impossible for you to see that a consumer will end up committing its funds to such commodity. So satisfaction is very, very important. Then now, what then is this satisfaction? Now this will bring us to what we understand as utility. Satisfaction, utility, they are in tandem. When we say utility, utility is the satisfaction derived from the consumption of a commodity. Utility for a consumer to continue purchasing a particular commodity, there has to be a high level of utility from this product. Now, the more they desire to acquire such products or such commodity, then the higher the level of what? The higher the level of utility. And utility is very, very subjective. It's very, very subjective in the sense that now this satisfaction ranges between different individuals. Some individual finds some commodity detrimental, while some individual finds some commodity beneficial. So depending on the purpose of or the extent at which this individual or the consumers derive satisfaction from the commodity. And also, so it is the utility or the satisfaction is very important. Now, whether the product is a bad product or whether the product is a good product, satisfaction is very important. And it is also important to know that these consumers that we are talking about, they are rational. So when we are talking about rationality, rationality means that the consumers are concerned about investing or committing their funds into a particular commodity or product that gives them the utmost satisfaction. So if they do not derive utmost satisfaction from a product, it will be very, very hard for you to see that a consumer will end up being loyal. It will be very, very impossible for them to continue to be loyal to such product, and it would be very, very impossible for them to what continue patronizing that particular business or the commodity itself. So that is utility. Now utility can be of different kinds. Utility, we have firstly we have the time utility. The time utility, we have the place utility, and we have the form utility. So when we say time utility, utility, as I've explained earlier, is a satisfaction derived from the consumption of a commodity. So time utility, as the term implies, time, this signifies that the satisfaction that will be derived from the consumption of a commodity is attributable to a particular period or a season. That is, before a consumer can derive satisfaction from a product, it must be at a particular season or a particular period of time. For example, during raining season, most people tend to be during raining season, it is very obvious that there would be existence of cold. That is, most people would experience cold, and we have some people that basically naturally they are allergic to excessive cold. So during those period, commodities like sweaters would have more patronage, because people will tend to buy more of these sweaters, since they understand that once they use these sweaters, it will reduce the extent of cold in their body. Also, umbrella is also a good product during what during raining season, because they know that once they can use the umbrella to protect themselves from getting drenched in the rain. So time utility is satisfaction that is derived on a particular commodity in relation to a particular period or a season. So likewise, during sunny seasons, also during sunny seasons, they would in the consumers would want to look for things that would actually cool their body or cool their mind, most especially if it is a region that is very, very hot. They want to look for things that would cool their body. Like during those periods, they want to take things that are chilled, because basically normally the body itself exhibits homeostasis, that is the internal regulation of the body. So it generates heat. So they would definitely need something that would reduce the extent of this heat in their body. So that is time utility. Now, place utility. Place utility is a type of utility that relates to the satisfaction can be derived only when it is situated at a particular place. For example, in the north, we understand how precious cows are in the north. So cows are very, very precious in the north, that they do not joke with their cows and mostly some of their animals there. But the consumption of cow in the north is very, very less. That is, the satisfaction derived from the consumption of cow in the north is less. But once this cow has been transported into Lagos, then the satisfaction that would be derived would be what? Would be high. Also, taking for example, when we look at some Islamic countries like Saudi Arabia, we have Iran, Iraq. You can never dare go there and start selling start selling pork meat, you can get arrested, because over there, when it comes to pork meat is against their religion there. So the extent of satisfaction that will be derived from such pork meat are usually what? Minimal. But when those pork meat are transported into some other countries that finds it so much interesting, or that finds solace in consuming it, then the satisfaction tends to be what? High. Also, alcohol, before Saudi Arabia lifted the ban on alcohol lately, the consumption of alcohol also in Saudi Arabia is also prohibited. So the consumption of alcohol there, the satisfaction derived from it is less, but in other places that accept the consumption of alcohol, the satisfaction derived from it is what? Is high. So what I'm just trying to say in a nutshell is that there are some commodities that the existence of those commodity at a jurisdiction, or at a particular area, and the satisfaction derived from them would be less compared to other places where people tend to derive more satisfaction from them, or where they are mostly appreciated. Then lastly is form utility. So form utility is also a type of utility that is concerned about converting a particular commodity into another form, or into another product, before people can derive satisfaction from it. Like, for example, we know that cocoa basically is being used for most of these chocolates and other products. So cocoa in its natural self, people tend to derive less satisfaction from it. But when this cocoa has been processed into another form, into chocolate, the satisfaction derived from it tends to be high. That is when you see people giving their preferences, like, I don't like, I love chocolate. Oh no, I don't like chocolate. I love dairy product. I love milky flavors. I love strawberry. I love a lot of them, like that, like that, like that. So before satisfaction can be derived from that product, then it has to be transformed into another what? Into another form, or another product. So with this, we've looked at the three basic types of utility: the time utility, place utility, and the form utility. Moving on, we have the approaches to utility. Now, the approaches to utility, there are basically two approaches to utility. We have the cardinalist approach. We have the cardinalist approach, and we have the ordinalist approach. So the cardinalist approach and the ordinalist approach. So these two approaches are two major approaches, or two approaches that are very germane in the study of utility. So, but for the purpose of this class, we would only be restricting ourselves to cardinalist approach. Then in subsequent classes, we'll look at ordinalist approach. So what do we understand by cardinalist approach? Now, cardinalist approach is an approach that highlights that utility can be measured. That is, utility can be measured, can be broken down into some specific units, or it can be measured in at a particular unit, which is usually recognized as utils. So utility can be measured. For example, when a particular commodity is being consumed, there are some extent of satisfaction that can be derived from that commodity. Is it to know the satisfaction that is derived from consuming one product, consuming two products, consuming three products, or consuming four products, or five, etc. So the idea behind identifying the units that is attributable to the consumption of each commodity is what we refer to as what? The cardinalist approach. And this approach was provided by the classicalist economists, or let's say the neoclassicalists, then the likes of Alfred Marshall. So they provided this approach that utility can be measured in utils. So to better understand the cardinalist approach, it is very important to look at the law of diminishing marginal utility. What then is the law of diminishing marginal utility? The law of diminishing marginal utility states that as more units of a product is consumed, the utility derived from it falls. That is, the more you continue to consume a product, the satisfaction that will be derived from the consumption of that product will what? Will fall. Take for example, you were very very hungry, you need to eat. Taking the first, let's say you took the first plate of rice, let's say rice, you took the first plate of jollof rice, you finished eating it. When you finished eating the first plate of jollof rice, even if you still feel hungry, the extent at which you were hungry in the first place would not be the to what extent you were hungry in this at the second stage of getting another plate of rice. So what this theory is highlighting is that when you consume more of a product, then the utility derived from it tends to fall. Now we can look at this, the quantity consumed in relation to total utility, and we can also look at it in relation to marginal utility. Now this law is in relation to the marginal utility, but if we are looking at the quantity consumed and the total utility, we notice that when you keep on consuming the product, the successive consumption of a product will tend to give you more and more and more and more and more and more and more satisfaction. That is, satisfaction can increase at first, but there would be a particular time when an additional consumption of that product will tend to bring about less satisfaction. But when we are relating consumption of a commodity to diminishing to the marginal utility, the consumption of that commodity to marginal utility tends to bring about a reduction in marginal utility. That is, the more you increase the quantity of goods consumed, the marginal utility you are deriving from that commodity tends to what? Tends to fall. So the higher the commodity consumed, the lower the marginal utility. And of course, it will get to a point whereby after decreasing, then the marginal utility will start what? Will start declining. Although it can actually get to a particular point first where the total utility has already reached its maximum. When the total utility has reached its maximum, this point is usually regarded as the saturation point. That is, the consumer has gotten to the highest level of satisfaction. So once he has gotten to the highest level of satisfaction, at that point the marginal utility would have been zero. That is, it would have been zero. So any further intake of such commodity as at that time, the total utility will start falling, but the marginal utility will start what? Declining. The result will start appearing in negative. So we can actually demonstrate this using an hypothetical view. So here, let's say we have quantity consumed, we have the total utility, we have the marginal utility. Let's say in the first consumption we have zero, nothing was consumed, nothing. So for the first one, let's assume that the total utility is 4, the marginal utility, the quantity consumed, the second is 2, the total utility became 7. On the third consumption of the commodity, the total utility became 9. The fourth, the total utility was 10, and the fifth, the total utility was 10 again. Then On the 6th, the total utility reduced to 9. So here, for the marginal utility was 4, then this 3, 2, 1, 0, and -1. So this is a clear representation of this law, that is just to demonstrate the law of the diminishing marginal utility. That is, when zero commodity was consumed, the total utility was 0, the marginal utility was also 0. When the quantity was 1, the total utility increased to 4, while the marginal utility was also 4. Then like that, like that, like that. And you would notice something about the total utility. The total utility, that is the overall utility you derive from consuming that product. This is it. So from 4 it increased to 7, from 7 it increased to 9, then from 9 it increased to 10, then from 10 it still remain at 10, then when there is an additional consumption, then the utility started what? Falling. And that is how it will keep falling and falling. But in relation to the marginal utility, that is, as more unit of good is consumed, the marginal utility derived from it will what? Will fall. So when the consumption was 1, the marginal utility became 4, reduced to 3, 2, 1, then 0. So when it became this 0, you will notice that total utility was already at the maximum. So when total utility was at the maximum, that signifies the saturation point. When it was at the maximum, marginal utility was 0. The moment total utility started reducing, marginal utility started what? Declining. So this is a clear hypothetical illustration of the law of diminishing marginal utility. So you need to understand that when you are relating the quantity to the total utility, that is when you say something like the more the consumption of a commodity, the satisfaction tends to increase at first, but there will be a point where an additional consumption of the commodity will bring about reduction in what? In satisfaction. Now, if you are looking at the diminishing marginal utility itself, that is in relation to marginal utility, that is when an increase in a consumption of a commodity will result in the reduction, it will result in the decrease in the marginal utility. And any, for the ones that reached 0, any further consumption of such commodity, the marginal utility will decline. So now, this hypothetical illustration can also be illustrated graphically on a curve. Now, by taking cognizance of the quantity consumed, the total utility, and the marginal utility. So we can have this is an hypothetical diagram where we have here the utils. Remember, I told us that utility is measured in utils. So utils, and then we have the quantity consumed. So we have here 0, and okay, we have 4, 7, 9, 10, 10, and 9. So under utils, let's say we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Okay, and here also we have the same thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right. So now the quantity consumed. Now relating the quantity consumed to total utility. When the quantity consumed was 0, total utility was also 0. When the quantity consumed was 1, total utility was 4. So when the quantity consumed was 1, total utility was 4. Likewise, when total utility was When quantity consumed was 2, total utility was 7. So quantity consumed 2, total utility 7. So we have this. And moving on, when quantity consumed was 3, total utility became 9. So quantity consumed 3, total utility was 9. And when quantity consumed was 4, total utility was 10. Also, quantity consumed was 5, total utility was also 10. Then, lastly, when total utility was 6, when quantity consumed was 6, total utility fell to 9. So, total utility fell to 9. All right. So, if we trace these dots, we have something like this, All right, this is fine. So now looking at marginal utility also, for marginal utility, when the quantity consumed was 0, marginal utility was also 0. When the quantity consumed was 1, marginal utility became 4. So quantity consumed was 1, marginal utility 4. And when quantity consumed was 2, marginal utility became 3. When quantity consumed was 3, marginal utility became 2. So marginal utility. And when quantity consumed was 4, marginal utility was 1. So when quantity consumed was 5, marginal utility dropped to 0. And when quantity consumed became 6, marginal utility became -1. So -1, we have it below this, -1. So 6, it became -1. So if we trace this, we have this for the marginal utility. All right, so this is how the curve looks like. This is how it looks like. So we can see that the law of diminishing marginal utility was evidently portrayed here. That is, when we are relating quantity consumed to total utility, the more the consumption of that commodity, the higher the satisfaction derived. To some extent, the satisfaction derived will increase at first, but it will get to a point whereby an additional consumption of that commodity will bring about a reduction in satisfaction. So this is exactly what is happening. What we are presented here is what we have also shown here as the diagram for this. Now, for quantity consumed to marginal utility, as more unit of a good is consumed, the marginal utility derived from it falls. So the more the quantity of goods that is being consumed, then the more the satisfaction derived from it falls. And that is what we have also illustrated here. Now, on this diagram, we can notice 3 basic things. Now, the first thing is that when the quantity of goods was increasing, the total utility was also increasing. And as the total utility was increasing, the marginal utility started falling. So the marginal utility fell, total utility was what? Was increasing. Now also when total utility was at the maximum, that is at the highest point, at the saturation point, that is the saturation point, the point at which the consumer tends to get the highest level of satisfaction. So when the total utility was at the maximum, then marginal utility became what? Became 0. So that shows that if there is any additional consumption of any extra, or if there is any additional consumption of a commodity, then at that moment total utility will start falling and marginal utility will also start declining. So at the highest point of the total utility, marginal utility has already clocked 0, and that this point can be regarded as what we refer to as the saturation point. So this point is where the consumer tends to get the highest level of satisfaction. So that is a saturation point. And why this point? This is the point at which the marginal utility became 0. So and when there was an additional consumption of the commodity, the total utility started falling while the marginal utility started what? Declining. And that is how we had -1 here. So this is a graphical illustration of the law of diminishing marginal utility, while this is a hypothetical tabular illustration of law of diminishing marginal utility. So that is the law of diminishing marginal utility. Then moving on to the next thing, which is the concept of total utility, average utility, and marginal utility. Now, when we say total utility, total utility is total utility is the total satisfaction that is derived from the consumption of commodities. What is the total satisfaction you derive from consuming different kind of commodities? What is that satisfaction? And that is what the total utility is talking about. So we want to know all the satisfaction that is being derived. So that is what total utility is all about. And total utility is calculated as the average utility multiplied by the quantity consumed. That is average utility multiplied by the quantity consumed. So this is how the total utility curve looks like. The total utility curve looks somehow like this. So just like we've shown it here, this is how the total utility curve looks like. So total utility, average utility times quantity consumed. Then average utility. What then is average utility? When we say average utility, we are talking about the satisfaction derived from the consumption of a single commodity. Average utility. When you consume just one kind of commodity, let's say for example, you have so many things. Let's say during the period of Ramadan, you fasted, and when it was time for you to break, you already have several varieties of food. You have rice, you have bread, you have beans, you have yam, you have different kinds of foods available. So the satisfaction you derive from eating each of those food is what we refer to as average utility. So the satisfaction derived from the consumption of just one kind of commodity. And the average utility is also calculated as the average utility is calculated as total utility divided by the quantity consumed. So it's calculated as total utility divided by the quantity consumed. So the average utility curve also slopes downward, but it's not like the marginal utility. The average utility curve is like this. This is how it looks like. So it also slopes downward. So it's actually a curved line from the left hand side to the right hand side. So that shows the satisfaction derived from the consumption of just a single kind of commodity. So that is the average utility. Now, lastly, which is the marginal utility. The marginal utility is the additional satisfaction derived from the consumption of an additional commodity. Now, take for example, you have 5 different apples. You ate the first apple, you derived average utility. Now, once you eat the second apple, that additional 1 apple that you've eaten in extra is the marginal utility. So the marginal utility is the extra satisfaction you derive from consuming another extra commodity. But the 2 apples, the satisfaction you derive from the 2 apples altogether is the total utility. But the marginal utility is just the satisfaction derived, the additional satisfaction you derive from the consumption of the additional commodity. So from the consumption of an extra commodity or an additional commodity. So the marginal utility is calculated as changes in the total utility all over change in the quantity consumed. Change in total utility all over changes in the quantity consumed. So this is the formula to calculate the marginal utility. So remember that the marginal utility is just an additional satisfaction, and the marginal utility curve looks this way. It slopes downward from the left hand side to the right hand side. It looks somehow like the demand curve, and basically we can also say that a consumer would be at equilibrium if his marginal utility is equal to the price of such commodity. When the marginal utility of a particular commodity is equal to the price, so we can say that the consumer is at what? Is at equilibrium. That is what the additional satisfaction it derives is equal to the price of that commodity. So this are the explanations relating to total utility, average utility, and marginal utility. So the next thing to do now is to look at some arithmetical solutions or calculations under the total utility, average utility, and the marginal utility. So moving on, this is a question on that tests the concept of total utility, average utility, and marginal utility. So we have a quantity consumed from 0 to 6. The total utility has been provided, but the average utility was not known. Likewise, the marginal utility. So we want to solve for these blank spaces by applying the formulas that we have been provided with earlier. So for the average utility at quantity consumed 0, the average utility automatically will be 0. Marginal utility will also be 0. Now the total utility is 10 and quantity consumed is 1. To get the average utility, we know that the formula for average utility is total utility divided by the quantity consumed, as it was illustrated earlier. So 10 divided by 1 gives us 10. So we've gotten that, 10. Now the next is the average utility, the second average utility. Now we have 16, we have 8. So 16 divided by 2, since the formula for average utility is total utility divided by the quantity consumed. So 16 divided by 2 is 8. So 20 divided by 3 is 6.7 approximately. Then 22 divided by 4 is 5.5. So 23 divided by 5 is 4.6. And then 23 divided by 6 is 3.8. So the average utility, this is the average utility. So as total utility, as it increases, the average utility kept on what? Reducing. So that is an indication of that curve that shows that it is also falling, but it's not like the marginal utility that it's a straight line. So the marginal utility as well, to calculate the marginal utility, remember that the marginal utility is calculated as changes in the total utility all over change in the quantity consumed. So the quantity consumed. So here, to get the change in total utility of the first one, this will be 16, this will be 10 minus 0 all over 1 minus 0. So 10 minus 0 is 10, 1 minus 0 is 1. So the answer, the marginal utility to this is 10. The marginal utility to that is 10. Now, moving on, what is the marginal utility of the second consumption? So the marginal utility of the second consumption is 16 That is total utility 2 minus total utility 1 all over quantity consumed 2 minus quantity consumed 1. So 16 minus 10 all over 2 minus 1. So this gives us 6 all over 1, and our answer is 6. 6. So same thing applies to this. The same thing, we do the same thing for the rest of them. 20 minus 16 all over 3 minus 2. So this gives us 4. 22 minus 20 all over 4 minus 3. 22 minus 20 all over 4 minus 3. This gives us 2. 23 minus 22 all over 5 minus 4. This gives us 1. And 23 minus 23 all over 6 minus 1 minus 5. This gives us 0. So the marginal utility, so let me write this well, since we understand how it is being gotten. So 6. So the marginal utility space has already been provided with the answers. Likewise, the average utility has already been provided with answer. So this is how to work out questions that comes under total utility, average utility, and marginal utility. So in the next class, we would be looking at the second approach to utility. So the second approach to, like I said earlier, I said we have two approaches to utility. We have the cardinalist approach and we also have the ordinalist approach. The cardinalist approach explains that utility can be measured in what? In units, while the ordinalist approach explains that utility can be ranked. So in our next lesson, we would dwell more on the second approach to utility.